So we saw before about how plants have their specialized compounds that can help them navigate the world that they can't necessarily move around in. And we've got another topic that's going to deal a little more specifically with plants responding to their environment. And kind of in the middle of those two topics is this topic of plant hormones. So hormones are a class of molecules that are involved in communicating a lot of times within the plant itself. So cells communicating to other cells, sometimes in a programmed fashion, sometimes in a response to the environment, and achieving a set result. And it's a rather complex topic, and I'd say there's a lot of research still being done on plant hormones. In some ways, they're rather simple. There's just not as much to them, I think, as I might expect. Uh, but they are definitely important and involved in a lot of different responses and important phases in development as well. So my entry image here is some developing bananas, and we'll see how hormones are also involved in ripening of fruit. So that's why I chose that image. So we saw this before, this idea that plants are not able to move around in their environment. And so they have to have sometimes these chemical solutions for dealing with their environment. So we talked before in the topic about specialized compounds, focusing a lot more on specialized compounds that are important for defense. We saw toxins and other molecules there. And then attraction, so molecules that are involved in scent signaling or visual signaling to animals. Those are important roles for these specialized compounds. And today's topic also involves specialized compounds, but in a whole other kind of direction, where we're talking about the molecules that are involved in also kind of substituting for something that we're familiar with in animals that plants don't do. So plants don't have a nervous system, but instead they have this chemical system of communicating among cells. So this is illustrating something that we'll see a little bit later. This is actually a wound response in plants that's been illustrated a lot more in neat, interesting detail lately in the past few years. But it also kind of highlights what you might expect to have the appearance of kind of a nervous system in plants. So plants do have these channels of conducting water and nutrients. As we've seen, the veins of the leaves are part of the vascular system. And those cells also can be involved in transporting these chemical signals. So they can respond sometimes in short amounts of time, sometimes just developmentally. So as a plant reaches a certain size or encounters certain light levels, then there's a chemical signal that goes to the plant to communicate that external environment. So plant hormones, a really big category, and I find it a little bit difficult to teach because it's not necessarily the kind of thing where there's this one-to-one perfect relationship with this is the hormone, this is the chemical, and this is the output. We're going to see a lot of molecules that have sometimes a variety of different outputs depending on what the cells are, depending on what the organism is, what the cues are. So they're not isolated signals that are perfectly defined in every plant, but I'll show you lots of examples of what hormones are involved in and some of the research areas where people have made some strides. This is one of the areas where we understand hormones to act, and also a nice illustration of what kind of we mean by hormones. So we have this chemical, this is a cultivated grape where they artificially add a hormone. This is a hormone molecule known as gibberellin, and they add it or don't add it to these grapes as they're developing. And the presence of this gibberellin hormone causes the plant to invest more into the development of these grapes. So they become bigger grapes. And if you were interested in growing these for yourself, you'd get a much bigger nutrient sugar output from the plant by kind of tricking it into investing more in those. And you could do that simply with the addition of this chemical molecule signal. So hormones in general, you're probably familiar with hormones from studying the same kind of processes in animals. When we talk about hormones, we're talking about molecules So it's sort of a molecule that is understood by the cells as conveying a certain kind of signal. So when the molecule is present, a certain kind of result happens. Um, and when the molecule is absent, then you don't get that response. So this is from one of your textbooks, the physiology textbook. And I don't want you to worry too much about all the details here, but basically focus on the top, the input, and then at the bottom here, we have response. So something about the environment or something about development is the starting cue for the production of one of these hormones. So there are cells that produce the hormones. Sometimes the hormones are involved near where they're produced. Sometimes they're transported to other parts of the plant. So we'll see some hormone transporters, and then ... Eventually there's a response. So basically there's a cell that receives this chemical signal from somewhere else in the plant, and that signal, the presence of that chemical, causes the result, the response to happen. So this is kind of what we mean by hormones, and I'll show you lots of examples of what kinds of responses can be achieved by using hormones. So there's some big categories of molecules. I've grayed out a couple on here, the salicylates and polyamines and so on from this publication. And I left in the ones that are more brightly colored here are the ones that we will talk about. It's, as I said, kind of a field that I think is receiving a lot more study now. And probably to somebody else, this makes full and complete sense. But to me, I feel like there's a lot left to be illustrated with what hormones can do in plants. And it's hard to generalize sometimes, right? So we have different kinds of plants using different kinds of signals, and the same signal is not necessarily doing the same thing in every plant. So I mentioned that this topic kind of builds off of what we covered before, this idea of the specialized molecules. So hormones, maybe not specifically required by the plant for their very basic biology and metabolism, but they're very important to maintaining the health of the plant. And they, as hormone molecules, these classes of molecules that we'll talk about, they branch off from some of these more familiar parts of the basic metabolism. So gibberellins, epsizates, cytokinins, auxins, these are the kinds of molecules that I showed you in the previous slide. And they're branching off largely from this pyruvate step here. So again, just having the ability to make those molecules, that's an important part of the process. And then of course, receiving the signal that those molecules are present and responding in a way that is beneficial. Those are all evolved processes that have molecules, so enzymes and proteins and so on, that are involved in interpreting these signals. And it gets complicated, so I didn't want to get into anything too molecular with this, but this is just illustrating one part of the process, and it illustrates this gibberellin illustrated here as GA. So we saw in seed germination, gibberellic acid can be important. Gibberellic acid is a member of the gibberellin class of hormones. And so it's shown here as a hormone being received by a receptor molecule. So again, having the signal present is important, but also having something, some way to understand the presence of that molecule signal, that's also important. So we have the GA, gibberellic acid signal, received by a protein receptor in the membrane of the cell. And so that's an exterior signal that then becomes an interior series of also signaling. So again, gets kind of complicated, but these arrows go from one molecule to another and eventually get us into the nucleus of the cell, where some genes are transcribed or not transcribed as a result. And ultimately, there's some kind of result output here. So this secretory vesicle, this rather complicated response, is all achieved by this one molecule starting point. So lots going on here. This would get you deep into the field of molecular biology if it's something you wanted to understand. Super cool, but also super complicated and difficult to cover thoroughly at this level for sure. All right, so hormones, we have lots of different kinds of hormones. And also I just want you to think about the different kinds of cells inside of the plant. So the plant, we've treated it as a rather simple organism. We've seen these just three big classes of cell tissue types, right? So the dermal tissue type and the vascular tissue type and the ground tissue type. And then within those, a little bit of subcategorization, but not too many different kinds of cells. That's how we've presented it so far. And depending on what kinds of cells those are, where they are in the organism, the same signal might cause them to have a different response. And this is also very beneficial, right? So if you are let's say your whole plant is sending out a signal of this hormone, the leaves, you might want the leaves to respond differently than the stem, differently than the roots, differently than the flowers, and so on. And so it ends up being kind of a match between the chemical and the identity of the cell as to what they're going to do in response. So just an illustration here, these are some of the features, some of the results that are known to occur in the presence of ethylene. Ethylene is one of these hormone molecules, and just a wide variety here, right? So fruits are ripening, leaf cells are dying, stem cells stop growing, and so on. Initiate flowering in the apical meristem. And so, like I said, it gets complicated. I think we can't really cover in much detail all the fine ins and outs of these kinds of processes.